Hello and welcome to this video on writing barriers and ways to overcome them. If you're preparing to write for publication in academic or peer-reviewed journals, then this video is for you. I'm Dr. Ruth Belling, and as a researcher, writer, tutor and doctoral supervisor, I spent much of my career writing for academic journals and helping students and colleagues achieve their own publication goals through writing workshops and one-to-one coaching. During these workshops and coaching sessions, I hear a lot of issues, anxieties and concerns people have about writing for publication, particularly when it comes to peer-reviewed journals. The reason for sharing this with you today is because it's been my experience that these issues, uncertainties, frustrations and anxieties hold people back. They can lack confidence in their ideas, question the value of their research, or their ability to communicate effectively through their writing. If not addressed, these anxieties and uncertainties can easily become entrenched and form obstacles or barriers to writing. In some cases, these barriers can become reasons, quote unquote, not to write. The consequences vary from making it difficult to get started or settle into writing an article, through to abandoning it partway through, or finishing the paper but not actually taking that all-important next step of submitting their paper to a journal. So we're here because we want to encourage you to seize the opportunity to take your research to a wider audience and experience that wonderful sense of achievement and satisfaction that comes with seeing your work published. So if you're preparing to write a journal article, this session aims to help you succeed by exploring 6 common writing barriers researchers and scholars experience that may be relevant to your situation, and sharing some thoughts and observations on how to break through them. Before I dive into the barriers themselves, it might be useful to share a couple of things I've learned from the writing workshops I mentioned earlier. One is never to underestimate the level of impact people's issues, uncertainties and anxieties about writing, whether they express them or not, can have on them both personally and professionally. After all, writing is a big part of academic and research life, and the barriers I'm going to talk about shortly are not exclusive to writing for journals, but can affect almost any form of academic writing, from research proposals to reports, lectures to presentations, and book chapters through to theses and dissertations. In fact, pretty much any kind of writing that may be seen and judged by someone else. The second thing is how often the same issues, anxieties and barriers arise. Most people experience one or more, and all have the potential to hold people back and prevent them from achieving their writing aims. However, the good news is that, in my experience, if you choose to face them, most writing barriers weaken, shrivel up, or disappear altogether. Choice is the operative word here. No one can do this for you. Writing a journal article requires some commitment, and only you can choose to make it. Finally, I'm not a trained counsellor or therapist. I am a researcher who's been through the publication process many times, and my role during the workshops is to help students and colleagues achieve their writing objectives. I take a very practical and pragmatic approach to writing, and given that the workshop's ultimate goal is usually for participants to produce a publishable journal article based on their research, we'll explore each of the 6 barriers now with that same ultimate goal in mind, to write a publishable article for a peer-reviewed journal. So, here are the 6 most common barriers. The first is not knowing what to write about. The second is pretty much the opposite problem, having too many ideas for a paper and not knowing which to focus on. Number 3 is about communication and expression. People worry about finding the right words or feeling they won't be able to express their argument in such a way that readers who are not familiar with their research will understand it. Number 4 is one that seems to resonate with most people. Even if it wasn't uppermost in their minds at the start of a workshop, there are usually plenty of sympathetic nods around the room when anyone mentions it. And that is the feeling that work is already too busy and you just don't have the time to write that journal article. The last two are what I call the what-ifs. What if my paper is rejected? And closely related yet more personal and sometimes deeply held fear that the process itself may expose not just the research, but the individual themselves as not capable or not good enough in some way. So, how do you begin to break through barriers like these? Let's take a look at each of them. Deciding what to write about is a crucial and fundamental step. You can't really write a paper, certainly not a publishable one, without having some idea what it will be about. Sometimes people don't give themselves enough time to think this through. A good topic is usually some combination of what interests you and what you think might be important for others to know about your work. After a few exercises to help explore this, and time to think things through, most people usually come up with several topics and ideas they could write about. Another way, and one I'd recommend once you have some initial ideas, is to reframe the topic by thinking about it from the perspective of a potential journal editor. What do journal editors look for? The answer is they look for what's new, interesting and different. So if you're stuck for ideas, ask yourself, what's new, interesting or different about your research? But what if you have too many ideas, too many topics that you want to write about? Well, clearly you may have more than one paper, or you may have ideas that overlap and may be better combined. If you're having difficulty settling on a topic, you may need another way to narrow your focus. Again, you can do this by looking at your ideas from the perspective of a journal editor. So if you need to focus on what's new, interesting and unique about your research. Barrier number 3, thinking that you won't find the right words or be able to express your argument clearly. Sounds frustrating, right? Well, one reason for this is that when we write, our brains try to create and organise at the same time. I refer to it as the silent conversation. You know what I mean by that? It's when, as you write, you find yourself questioning what you've just written. Maybe you don't like a particular word, or you've introduced X and realised it might not make sense unless you include Y. And if you're going to include Y, wouldn't it be better to do it sooner, like page 1? Until at some point you realise you've stopped writing. Minutes have passed, sometimes longer, and you haven't added a single word to your document. That's what I mean by silent conversation. The problem with it is that it can make for very slow progress. So to write effectively, every one of us needs both creativity and the capacity to organise and edit our words. The challenge is in finding ways to allow each function to do its best work without interference. In all our online workshops, one way we tackle this challenge is by suggesting participants create a detailed outline before they write their first draft. Now, the concept of using an outline is by no means new, but I find people rarely create one that has enough information to be of practical value when it comes to writing their first draft. Your outline is the ideal place to focus on your argument, to identify the main points you need to make, and organise them so that your readers get the information they need in the most appropriate sequence. Having an outline should make it easier to write the first draft of your article, because you then shouldn't have to constantly shift things around as you write. You can then revise and edit your first draft later. Okay, barrier number 4, time. Well, of course, this barrier is not so much about time itself, but what you choose to do with the time you have. We all have competing demands for our time and attention, and what you choose to do with yours will depend on your goals and priorities. Just to give you an example, I did my PhD part-time while working full-time. That means I spent every Monday, most weekends and most evenings on my PhD for getting on for 6 years. Now, I don't say that because there's anything remarkable in it, far from it. Plenty of people study for higher degrees while holding down full-time jobs. I mention it because doing it that way taught me 2 vital lessons. The first is that when you have such limited time to set aside, organisation is essential. That means taking a realistic look at your schedule and breaking tasks into smaller pieces you can accommodate. On our writing workshops, it's the first thing we encourage you to look at, because if you don't have enough time to commit to the task, you're unlikely to finish, and no one wants that. And the second is to develop sustainable writing practices so that you build consistent and regular writing habits that will benefit you not just for the duration of a single paper, but well into the future. Sadly, there's no reliable formula for working out exactly how much time you'll need to write your paper. Any estimate should factor in your experience, how long the paper needs to be, whether you're writing alone or with co-authors, and your other commitments. However, you may find the 30-day challenge timeline on our website a useful starting point for papers of around 5,000 words. So we've looked at 4 of the most common writing barriers now. Not knowing what to write about, having so many ideas you can't focus, communication issues, and time. Let's move on to the final 2 barriers we're going to explore today. The what-ifs. Unlike the barriers we've already discussed, the issues presented may never actually happen, yet the possibility that they might is enough to fuel the kind of anxiety that can stop people even trying to write however much they may wish to. So, what if your paper is rejected? Well, first of all, papers are rejected by journal editors far more frequently than you might imagine. In fact, it happens to most scholars at some point in their careers. There's a saying you may have heard: the only difference between a published author and an unpublished one is persistence. To be successful, you need to take the attitude that you are not your paper. You have to detach yourself emotionally from your ideas and your research and learn to consider every paper from the perspective of a prospective journal editor and publisher, not simply as an author. Journal editors receive far more papers than they can ever publish, so it's up to you to maximise your paper's chances of acceptance. Now, there are several things you can do about that, and the good news is they're not that difficult. Firstly, don't make it easy for editors to say no. That includes following whatever instructions they give to authors regarding article formatting and what to include in your covering letter that accompanies your article submission. Below this video you'll find a link to an article from one such editor that makes for very enlightening reading on this subject. It also contains practical advice on what you can do to avoid rejection, so it's well worth a read. Secondly, once you know what an editor is looking for, give it to them. We talked about this earlier when we considered ideas for your article. You can also find out more in steps 2 and 3 of the 10-step process we teach during our online workshop, How to Write a Journal Article. Thirdly, should an editor decide your paper is not a good fit for their journal right now, do something positive and send it to the next journal on your list. Also, bear in mind that once your paper reaches the review stage, an editor and their staff have already invested a good deal of time and effort in it, so a more likely option is that an editor will suggest revisions rather than give you an outright no. Revisions may seem daunting, but they can also be positive, making your paper stronger, clearer, and better targeted to the needs and interests of your readers. It's still your decision, of course, whether to make any changes reviewers and editors suggest, but if you do, and resubmit, the editor is more likely to publish. Which brings us to the sixth and final barrier that really holds people back. What if I'm not good enough? As you can see, this is very closely related to the previous barrier, but the implied rejection feels much more personal. In most cases, the approach to resolving this is the same as the one just described. You have to find a way to separate yourself from the review and publication process, and ask yourself what lies behind your concerns. Often people feel anxious because they have reservations about some aspect of the research on which their paper is based. Just remember that all research has limitations, nothing is perfect, and limitations usually spur further research. So if you've been thinking about writing a journal article, but any of the issues we've discussed today have been holding you back, I hope you'll find a way to move forward and make your goal a reality. Thanks for watching, and here's to your success.